Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see so many wonderful faces. Thank you all for attending, and a special shout out to our fabulous friends on Zoom. I'm Leslie Ledegar, and I'm Vice President of the Board of Directors at Camp Rehoboth Community Center. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I also want to give a shout out to our fabulous staff that is here in the room, and two of our board members, one of whom was really instrumental in putting this together, Tara Sheldon, and David Garrett is also here from the board. Camp Rehoboth stands for Creating a More Positive Rehoboth, CAMP. Founded over 30 years ago by founders Murray Archibald and Steve Elkins, celebrating diversity, building a strong sense of community, and creating a more positive environment for all people, gay, straight, non-binary, or wherever people find themselves, has always been at the heart, and I always put that heart sign up, has always been at the heart of Camp Rehoboth philosophy. Camp Rehoboth is a 501c3 nonprofit community service organization whose mission is dedicated to creating a positive environment inclusive of all sexual orientations and gender identities in Rehoboth and its related communities. We seek to promote cooperation and understanding among all people as we work to build safer communities with room for all. Our vision is to create proud and safe communities where gender identity and sexual orientation are respected. Now, for those of you who don't know, Camp Rehoboth has been helping LGBTQ youth for quite some time. We have 4 Youth Up programs, which are run by camps Julian Harburg and Amber Lee, who is right here. And those programs are Youth Up Monthly Social, Youth Up community outings like bowling, Youth Up book club, and Youth Up discussion group. Through these 4 programs, Camp Youth Up builds and creates a safe space for queer youth and their allies to get together and socialize without fear of hatred or judgment. Youth can also get a chance to interact with queer adults, such as some of us in the room. And that can be such a positive experience because when you're a kid, you might not know that you could actually grow up to be a successful person. And it helps to see other people in the room that sort of model that behavior for you. We also have camp families. I mentioned Tara Sheldon. Camp Families is led by Tara, and this is a network of LGBTQ inclusive families, including families with LGBTQ parents, families with LGBTQ children, and sometimes a little of both. We do see some overlapping in our programming at camp and students belonging with peers, especially in school environments. Growing up and trying to figure out who you are is no easy task. I know we can all remember that, and we can all relate to that. Kids face unbelievable uncertainty and stress as they are seeking to form themselves against raging social and societal pressures, both from fellow kids and their parents. They can seem frightening, daunting, and insurmountable. And it's very different being an LGBTQ youth in Delaware versus being a successful retired LGBTQ adult. For example, and don't raise your hand, but just think about these questions. Are you the parent of a non-binary kid? Sorry about that. Or a kid in transition? Have you ever been shamed into using the nurse's restroom or forced to use the gender-designated restroom to which you were assigned at birth, but no longer matches who you are? Are you a kid or the parent of a kid who has been so bullied that they are afraid to go out in public? Literally afraid of their own shadow. In Southern Delaware, a lot of youth live in environments and go to schools that are unsupportive or are actively hostile, which makes it crucial that they can find other youth like them. We really think that the guide can help respond to the concerns or challenges of these stories that I was just telling you in those examples. This seminar and the guide that we will be discussing this evening will, I hope, put some very powerful tools and resources at your fingertips. These resources did not exist even 10 years ago. And I think as you'll see, whether you're a kid or a parent, that having just this amount of support would have been incredible back then, incredibly helpful back then, as it is now. I see some heads nodding in the room. So that is why CAMP jumped at the opportunity to co-sponsor this presentation, because you are just that important. Thank you so much. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our interim director, Lisa Evans, to monitor the panel.
Thank you. Unlike them, I'm sitting. Thank you and good evening. It's wonderful to be here and to see all of you. And I'm thrilled about being a part of this panel. And without further ado, we are going to start on that. As has been mentioned, part of the aim of the panel this evening, we're going to talk about Know Your Rights, newly released, as it was said, the ink is even dry. And we'd like to talk about this guide to the First Amendment, how it affects LGBTQ plus children, youth, and how we all can use it and what value it will have in both our work and in our personal lives. I'd also like to immediately go and introduce each panelist. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. Start with Andrea. It's on. They're all live.
Hi, I'm Andrea Rashbaum, and I wear a couple of different hats. I'm one of the co-founders of PTK Delaware, which is parents of trans and gender expansive youth. I could talk loud. I'm a teacher. What about now? What about now? I'll try again. I've never told I'd talk quietly. I'm Andrea Rashbaum, and I'm one of the co-founders of PTK Delaware, where parents of trans and gender expansive kids. Don't let kids fool you. Our parents have kids from 5 years old to 43 years old. So we don't mean little kids necessarily. My own daughter is my stepdaughter, and she's 22. She was born in the year 2000. And she socially transitioned in 2010 when there were no rights for her. There were always rights for her. We just didn't know how to get schools to be convinced that there were rights for her. So I'm also an educator in Delaware, so I do a lot of advocacy in the education arena. And this is really important because it gives us language that we can use consistently throughout our schools.
Testing 1, 2, 3, just hold it close.
Hi, everyone. How close?
All right. How about this one? You might feel more comfortable with that one.
Don't swallow it.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Amber Lee. I'm the Health and Wellness Coordinator at Camp Rehoboth. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I look forward to being able to discuss Know Your Rights with everyone tonight.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Testing more. All right. Hi, everyone. Dwayne Bensing, he, him. I'm the legal director of the ACLU of Delaware. I'm so excited about this evening, about being with you all, and I'm really excited about this Know Your Rights resource. I actually started my career before I was an attorney as a middle school teacher. And on my very first day of school, Angelina raised her hand and said, hey, mister, I don't mean nothing by it, but are you gay? So I cannot even be closeted to a 6th grader. I'm so gay. I didn't want to be, but it was the beginning of a great journey for me as a middle school teacher. But you know, this is really near and dear to my heart as a former educator. I started my career as a civil rights attorney with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division Educational Opportunities Section, and then at the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. And in both of those offices had a role doing a lot of work on behalf of transgender and gender nonconforming students and their rights in the classroom. So I'm really excited about this evening and that we brought all these fantastic folks together to talk about this important issue.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. My name is Caitlin McAndrews. I am an attorney in private practice in Delaware, working in the education law sphere and primarily in disability law. So I come to the conversation tonight really with a focus on the intersection of disability rights and the rights of LGBTQ plus students. I know that's a very particular subset. We might not get super into it tonight, but I think it's a really important one, and it's a real privilege to be here on this panel. I also started as an educator before going to law school. I have a real passion for education, and I think when in the right hands, education can make our youth who are feeling marginalized, can give them a safe place. And I think that this Know Your Rights Guide is a great resource for educators, and I just can't wait to see it go far in Delaware.
All right, testing, Anita, that one, and you can pass that one to him.
Okay, good evening. My name's Anita Smolian. I'm representing PFLAG tonight. But more importantly, I'm here as the parent of a transgender child who is 43 and a gay child who is 40. So as you can tell, I've been around the block. Moved here from New Jersey, where I was a licensed clinical social worker and worked in the schools for 25 years on a child study team. And I have the opportunity here in Delaware to advocate and also offer support to parents who are just beginning this process of accepting, dealing with their children who have said, I want to transition, or I'm gay. It's very gratifying. And I think that this resource book is so important because it gives us knowledge. Knowledge gives us power to affect change. So I read it last night, cover to cover, and there's good stuff in it. And I really would like that to go out to all, especially parents of kids. Thank you.
Terrific. What we'd like to do is have each panelist talk a little bit about the resources that their organization has to avail to everyone here, and also how you feel that you will use this guide in that work. And I'm going to start that off. I'm going to throw that one to Dwayne to start.
Oh, goodness. Well,
See,
we put our logo on the.
I hope everyone has read it.
So we get to take credit, but it really is a partnership, and we're excited to have so many other partners in the work. And Mike, I think, explained really well kind of the origin of this. We get so many requests, people are surprised, 21st century problems, but people get, surprised that we still receive intake from LGBTQ plus students about issues that really shouldn't have even been around in the 20th century, but there certainly shouldn't be around in the 21st century. And people always tell me, well, Dwayne, you're new to Delaware. You don't know Sussex County. I say, well, I'm from Arkansas, so maybe I do. But a hint. So, we received this intake, and I'm a lawyer, so it's funny that I'm saying this, but not everything needs to be a federal case, right? Don't even make a federal case out of everything. And Mike and I talked to him, we said, really think that there's an opportunity for education here. I've met a lot of educators in my career, and I've never met one that was openly hostile. I hate LGBTQ plus students. I'm sure that they are out there, but they've never said it to my face. So there's the undercurrent there, and I think most educators are doing the best they can with the information that's available to them and that's available in their schools, and are also taking the cues that they receive from their school administration and the State Department of Education and the Federal Department of Education. So we thought that there was an important opportunity for us to provide that information to students directly. And I think that you'll find that this resource is really written with students in mind. It's written from a standpoint of a young person really starting to get their mind wrapped around, what are my constitutional rights? What is my presence in a classroom? What is my expression, and what are the limits of that? We really want to educate those students directly so that they can advocate on their own behalf, because the best advocacy that's going to happen are when students are speaking with their own voice and their own power, owning that in their school communities. That's going to be the most impact. And so, we thought that this resource going out to the students directly, but also their family and their school administrators who are supportive of them would really help get us all speaking in the same kind of voice when we start talking about LGBTQ students in the classroom and what their rights are to protect them. Because I think that when you have a lot of different kinds of information coming at you from different sources, there can be some confusion. And teachers who are trying to do no harm may often create that harm unintentionally because they just don't know any better. And so we want to fix that from the front end. Now you know better, your students know better, your family members know better, and now this is a tool that you can use. So hopefully, instead of emailing the ACLU, which please do, we'll answer, you first go to the Know Your Rights booklet and say, oh, listen, page 4 says, Miss Teacher, and then we go from there.
Thank you. I'm going to have it come back here to Andrea to talk, Andrea, yes, sorry about that, to talk about PTK and how you'll use the resource guide.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'll just keep talking loud. We do have postcards if people want them with our email addresses on them, so you don't have to sit here and memorize it. And they're also on the camera table. So at PTK Delaware, we have monthly / sometimes bi-monthly, depending on the month. Holidays are tough for a lot of our families. We have either gatherings or meetings. Currently, we're meeting on Zoom every third Thursday of the month from 7 to 8:30 because we lost our physical space and we're currently looking for a new physical space. So we meet on Zoom where parents of trans kids and gender expansive kids of all ages, and we actually have our own resource guide, which if you're interested in, you can email us. And our resource guide covers local resources, local doctors that you might want to work with, local organizations, as well as national organizations. And then we have a whole section on helpful websites for people that may not understand what LGBTQ is all about. And we also have a book section that ranges from children's books that people can use to talk with their kids about, or that can be used in classrooms that teachers can use. And not every one of them says transgender. Some of them just says, it's great to be different. And it's great that we're all different. We also have young adult books for young adults that want to recognize themselves in literature, and adult books, either for our children who are adults or for our parents who need to understand our children who are adults. So that's what we do. I'm also my own resource because I go around and I advocate at schools and I do professional development work with school districts. I've worked with Capital, I've worked with Appoquinimink, I've worked with Brandywine, Colonial, Christina, a few of the charter schools. And so I do professional development because I'm a teacher in the state of Delaware and I understand what schools are like. And people are willing to talk to you when you're a teacher, and they're willing to insult you when you're a parent, not an actual LGBTQ person. Sometimes I get insulted and I'm like, okay, let's remember to be nice here. But for the most part, people are really open. And so I get to educate and sort of open people's eyes a little bit. What I like about this in particular was I like the idea of the right to petition and talking about the right to petition your government, because there's your local government too, which is your school district. And you can petition them for what you want. And I think reminding people of that First Amendment right is key. And I actually already started using this morning because I work for adult education, and we were talking about some of our LGBTQ students, and I said, do you know that they have the right? And I didn't say it because they were not treating the students well, but I just said, this is another thing that supports what we're doing. And they said, oh, we never thought about that before. So it's working already.
Anita, would you like to talk about
Sure.
PFLAG?
As I said before, I think this piece of literature will help us at PFLAG increase our knowledge. We at PFLAG provide support for parents who, as I said, who just coming to terms with the fact that they have gay, lesbian, transgender transgender kids. Also, it helps us with advocacy. However, this is just the first step. When I would work with a parent, I would want them to read this. And the second step is, okay, go about doing it. How can we help you advocate in the schools? How can we help you advocate at churches where they feel their children are not really accepted? So again, it's the first step, but it's so important to work on the hows, whens, and support these people, these parents. I always, some of the parents say, oh, I'm having such issues with my child, because oftentimes we go to conferences and this woman or man comes up and says, ah, I have a transgender child and I embrace it and I love it and it is so wonderful. And I think to myself, really? You embraced it in 12 minutes? So it's a process and you have to deal with your own feelings. I'm a clinical social worker. I can't say I embraced it. I said the right things because I knew what to say. And I never gave up loving my children, but I had to integrate into my being. So I want to work so carefully with parents to let them understand it's okay if you just don't embrace it in the first 12 minutes. Did you want to ask me something? There's somebody
There's a
there.
hand behind you. That's fine.
Oh, definitely. We're going to go through the panel and then we'll ask questions. Terrific. Sorry.
Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you. And next, Amber from Camp Rehoboth.
For Camp Rehoboth, this guide will give me the ability to help parents. Often we have parents come in and they're looking for resources. We have community members come in and they're looking for resources. A lot of times parents find that they just want to know how to help their child and they feel like they're at the end of the road. They don't know what to do. And to be able to hand them this guide and say, this will help you. This will tell you where to go. This will tell you how to go is nice because I can tell people how to do things, but they leave that door and then they're like, what did she say? I forgot. To have something tangible to give someone is amazing. It'll be great for when I'm doing community outreach or anyone on the Camp Rehoboth team is doing community outreach and be able to say, take this guide, hand this out, talk to people, tell them there's laws to protect their children. There's things for children to even know because as it was said, if they don't advocate for themselves, no one's going to advocate for them either. You know, they are their biggest advocate. I personally found it very interesting, and there was things that I've even learned as someone that's out here advocating in the community and a member of the community. So I look forward to being able to use this resource and being able to help our community continue to learn and grow.
Thank you. Caitlin?
So what services do we provide and how are we going to use this resource, right? So as I mentioned, I'm in private practice. My office represents families whose kids are struggling in school for one reason or another, but really typically through the lens of special education. And my background is as a special educator. So in terms of the intersection between disability rights and LGBTQ rights, typically the clients that I see fall into one of two camps. Either it's a child who is identifies as LGBTQ, has not had an easy journey of that, and as a result is struggling in school. Their emotional needs are really a result of them not being welcomed, them not, their rights not, as an LGBTQ youth, not being embraced and recognized. And so we're approaching their emotional needs in school and trying to get them that support. The second camp are students who had a pre-existing special need and maybe their voices aren't being heard as clearly when they are expressing their identity as an LGBTQ youth because of their disability. So like one example of some overlap that I see are students with autism who the adults in their life who care about them say, well, you don't have a good sense of social skills. You don't have a good sense of what the social construct of gender is. So maybe you don't understand what gender you really feel like you are because you don't understand the social aspects of gender. And so then their voices don't get heard as well. So that, you know, those are kind of the two areas of intersection that I see a lot. And I love that Wayne pointed out the good intentions of a lot of the adults in both educators, but also parents. You know, I have not met an educator before who said, I got into education because I just really dislike kids, right? Like no, nobody says that. And I think one of the greatest things in this resource and one of the ways that I plan on using it a lot is that it starts from, I think it's on like page 3, from the perspective that there are going to be people out there who really want to be allies, who don't have the language to maybe engage in the conversation that the youth wants to have, or they just don't know the rights of the youth. And that's, I think, why this guide is so important. So I plan to give it to parents who come to me who are struggling to talk with their kids. I plan to give it to kids who want to engage their parents in those conversations. I plan to give it to my clients who in Delaware, the educational rights transfer at age 18. So my clients who are young adults between the ages of 18 and 21 that are trying to be heard better in school and want to take this to their teacher who wants to help them but doesn't have the language to do that yet. I think it's going to be a great resource for that. Thank you.
I guess if appropriate now, let's go to some questions. Got one from over there?
Actually, hold on. Can the folks at home can't hear you. So if you wouldn't mind speaking into this so the people at home can hear what you're asking.
Yeah, I'll just stand up.
They still can't hear you. You need to be amplified. So if you could talk in here, then the folks who are
Yeah,
on
I
Zoom.
don't feel like
Okay. All right. Well, right. Other questions from the audience, please? Yes, where can we get they're in every bag. And I guess the question 2 is, okay, we might have missed that. And larger quantities of it, how do we get that? Do you want to come up and talk? If you would, Mike?
Yeah, so anyone who would like a copy or multiple copies of the guide can email our development director, Melissa Bryson. That's M as in Melissa, then BRYSON at ACLU-DE.org. Melissa will be getting all of those orders, and again, we'll be happy to send them out to any community groups, people that will make use of them. And again, they're all free of charge.
Yes.
Testing 1. At home.
Yes. Do you need this one? Okay.
All right, we have a panel, someone from home asked the panelists, what is the best way to respond to teachers or other school staff who refuse to use a trans, non-binary student's chosen name and pronouns in light of recent court cases that have overturned disciplinary actions against such individuals on First Amendment grounds?
Who would like to take that here? Well, one of the lawyers.
I'm curious to hear how Dwayne will contradict me here, but my, my go-to is documentation. Such a lawyerly answer. But if the conversation has been had in class, the student has advocated for themselves, I do usually want to follow it up with an email. And I always call it a sandwich email, right? That you start and end with pleasantries because we're still trying to be able to coexist together in the classroom. The teacher's not going to stop being your student's teacher the next day. So I start and end with pleasantries, and then the meat of the email is really documenting the concern. And the thing that I like about approaching it from that perspective is that if you keep, first of all, people are often reluctant to put into an email what they'll say in class. Maybe the teacher was caught off guard. Maybe the teacher just didn't know that what the proper response should be. And after further reflection or going to a mentor in the school, they're going to respond better. But also you can escalate an email if you need to. So if they're still responding with pushback, you can then copy kind of the next person up the chain on it. And now that we have the Know Your Rights Guide, you can link to it. I actually don't know if Mike said that, but I think it will be available in electronic form. So we could be able to include that as well when reaching out to schools, which I think is a really nice option.
I'd like to add that when a parent wants to start this process, I think, as you said, your first paragraph or niceties, I think we have to teach parents how to address these. We don't want our parents to go in as adversarials. I demand this and you better do it. I would like the approach to be, we have an issue here. How are we going to resolve it? My kid is feeling uncomfortable because the teacher does this. You can always go to the big guns, but I would start with parents addressing the issue.
Dwayne?
I think those are all really great advice. I think part of what Caitlin was saying, I think the other piece of this is changing the lens to really focusing in on that student, right? So the laws that protect your student, not only the First Amendment and expression, but also their access to an educational opportunity, right? So their access to that math curriculum, that English curriculum, the school, after school extracurricular activities, they ought to be given the same opportunity as any other student in that classroom. And if they are, if you have a teacher who doesn't even see your full identity in that seat and disrespects you on a daily basis, that is a student who is in a hostile environment, right? And so if that hostile environment denies them that educational opportunity, and this is language that educators know, right? And you can explain to the teacher as best you can, but at the end of the day, your student is entitled to that free and appropriate public education, and we should do what needs to be done to make sure that they are put in a classroom and in a school building that can support them and their full identity. So I think that all of that is exactly the right approach, but I hope that maybe this handbook will help us have those smoother conversations and document and base, where we need to go next.
Thank you.
For additional questions, if people have them, you can raise your hand and I will come to you so that we can hear your question online.
Is it worth mentioning the OCR?
Yes, please.
Yes. I think we all were emphasizing the need to well, especially needed in that we language, to be collaborative and to try to work through things. And so a complaint process sounds pretty adversarial, but the OCR complaint process is meant to be accessible to lay people. As Dwayne said, if you are denied access to that educational opportunity that you have a right to, that is squarely within OCR's investigative powers. And you can just Google OCR complaint and it will take you to the website to be able to make one of those complaints.
Additional questions? Yes.
OCR's
she-
Office for Civil Rights, the Department of
That
Education
was the question.
Office
Yes,
for Civil Rights. And it's, and exactly like Caitlin said, it's a, you know, it's a process that's for parents and students to advocate on their own behalf. And one of the initial evaluations that will be made is whether this is an appropriate case for mediation. And so that's where you have a third party kind of step in and talk to everybody involved to figure out what their interests are and what needs to be done. There's also accelerated remedies with the Office for Civil Rights that are all before you even would step into a courtroom. Hopefully the Office for Civil Rights would be able to remedy this, you know, quickly. That way your student can get the access they deserve.
We had another question online. We've talked a bit about the rights of LGBTQ students, but a person online wanted to know what are the rights of LGBTQ teachers for self-expression in the classroom, and are there any boundaries or limitations to that?
Anybody want to take a whack at that? Dwayne?
I love that question because back in the Stone Ages, when I was entering the classroom coming from Arkansas, where there were no employment protections at that time, and I'm excited about our next panel to have more conversation about the rights of teachers. When I moved to Philadelphia, the state of Pennsylvania did not have statewide protections for LGBTQ teachers, but the city of Philadelphia actually did, which was such a foreign, novel concept for me, but one that I relied upon pretty heavily as soon as I got my mind wrapped around it, that, oh, I had the protection that I could not be terminated or disciplined because of my gay status as a teacher in the classroom. And so teachers preserve quite a bit of their constitutional rights. This is when the lawyers say it depends, right? Because they also are wrapped into their employment contract with the individual school districts, which may limit their expression in a reasonable way within the classroom and the bounds of the curriculum. But there's pretty great protection under it'd be Title VII and for work employment, Title IX for education recipients, where discrimination based on your gender orientation or gender expression or sexual orientation is prohibited form of discrimination. So, I mean, I think it depends. There are protections that are federally recognized now. The state of Delaware has additional protections to prohibit discrimination. But the role of the teacher in the classroom may create boundaries upon what is appropriate within the classroom speech for that individual teacher, where teachers may have more limitations on their expression than what a student may have. Fix it up. Clean it up.
I can't do better than that. The question that I had was expression. But you know, my understanding is that you cannot be disciplined for identifying as an LGBTQ teacher. It's the expression question that I don't know, and employment law is unfortunately outside my realm.
Yeah. No, I was going,
I think
the
Andrea.
question also to you, Andrea, was as you do professional development with teachers, how do you approach these things?
So a couple of different ways. Number one, it is great when students have LGBTQ teachers who are out and proud. And I don't necessarily mean loud and proud, but out and proud. Loud and proud is great too, but just out is fantastic. And one of the things I talk to staffs about is I often have them raise their hand and say, how comfortable you are with your fellow teachers? You know, if they tell you they're LGBTQ. And they're like, oh, we're great. We accept everybody, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, how many LGBTQ teachers do you think you have in your school? And usually they'll say 3 to 5, something like that. And then I say, how many of them have pictures of themselves with their partners and their families on their desk? And the room often goes, oh, like, I bet you do from that answer. So sometimes people think they're being open at schools, And it's a little thing. I'm not asking you to talk about, just like I wouldn't talk about private time with my husband. I often tell teachers, you're not going to talk about private time with your partner, right? But I'm certainly not going to not talk about my daughter and my child as a teacher. And that is perfectly within the right of talking as a teacher. I often equate it to administrators as I'm Jewish. The kids always know I'm Jewish. I'm very out and loud and proud and Jewish. And if there's a Jewish student class, I'll often say to them, like, hey, I'm Jewish too, like, just to let you know, right? So if a teacher does say, just so you know, I'm part of the LGBTQ community too, and that's it. It doesn't make a whole big thing, doesn't say, I can help you with everything to fight the school and fight your parents. That is perfectly acceptable. In terms of expression, as long as it follows the dress code for that district. So if they have a uniform, they have a uniform. But then, if they have Jeans Day or something and people are allowed to wear their favorite t-shirt on Jeans Day, then you're allowed to wear your favorite t-shirt on Jeans Day. So it just has to follow the same rules. And I've had people as a Jewish person tell me, well, you can't talk about that in class. And I was like, no, I can't try to convert anybody, but I can tell them I'm Jewish. It's really the same thing. And a lot of times when I make those connections with administrators, they're like, oh yeah, you're right, it is.
Question?
This may be somewhat of a rhetorical question, but across the state of Delaware, what are the similarities and differences from one school district to another in terms of awareness and practice and acceptance?
Who wants to take that one on?
There is no consistency. I'm being honest, because even in districts with policy, right, people sort of tweak the policies, right? I just found out about a district where we were working on a policy, and literally first day of school, the principal went and did something against the policy, and I'm like, ugh. And that's one school in one district where there is a policy. So there isn't consistency from what I see from advocating for children. It is literally not even district to district. It is school to school. However, the legalese is still the legalese. And one thing I'm going to point out about that, and schools often don't recognize it, is the first thing I do, forget all that First Amendment and all that, is I go to the mission statement of the school district. Whatever school it is, whatever policy it is, I go to the mission statement. Almost every time there's something about diversity, inclusion, and wanting all students to learn. Tell me how you're supporting your mission statement. And I want to tell you, there are some great teachers out there. There are some great administrators and counselors out there. But one of the things I try to get out when I do workshops is, according to the school climate survey, which is put out by GLSEN 2 years ago, if there are 11 positive adults for a child, whether it's a role model, whether it's someone that supports them, whether it's someone that just says, hey, I see you, or, nice bow in your hair today, or whatever it is, that child is more likely to be less absent, do their schoolwork, have less poor behavior, and graduate and go on to further education. 11 adults. Because sometimes what happens is people say, well, she's got it. No, we all need to get it. So I think there's a discrepancy. Do I think people are aware? 100% aware. 100%. Tolerant, I think that's the biggest box. They're tolerant. Accepting, we're getting it. And we really are. I do not want to say it's bad. I want to say we're getting there as people learn. I think the biggest box right now is tolerant, and we need to try to move people to accept.
Well said. Thank you. Questions from we have actually a question from the.
Yeah, we have a question from the Zoom. So this is a little bit of practical advice. So one person is wondering, is it appropriate for teachers and staff to ask or offer students if they want to be called by alternate name or pronouns, Or should they wait for the students to ask for the change themselves?
For me personally, I think that at the beginning of the school year is a great time to say, if you have a preferred name or a preferred pronoun, put it on the sheet of paper, let me know then. And then they kind of open the doorway for that so that they don't feel like they have to ask special permission or they're shy and come up and say something, by putting it out there, then the door's open for the youth.
I totally agree. I don't think that there is a right or wrong answer, but that it is a really welcoming way to start the school year. And you may not know what answers you will get, but there are people who have nicknames, right? Like you can present it in a way that's very open to students responding in whatever way they feel comfortable.
I definitely agree. I would just asterisk all of that and say that the students' process of understanding their own gender identity or sexual orientation is not in line with school calendar year. They may decide that on the first day of school, they're not there 3 months later. There's no statute of limitations for that. So definitely be open. That is the best practice. I think you've opened it up. So that's perfect.
Well said, thank you.
Can I just add one more thing to that? And be mindful that that name could change. It could change 3 times in a year. Their pronouns could change. Go with the changes. They're trying to figure out who they are and where they're going.
Thank you. There's
Thank
one
you.
more question
Yes.
online as well. As a future teacher, how can I use this information for a student who is gay but doesn't have the support of their parents? I was that gay student, and it's very scary to speak up to a teacher. How, if anything, can I be that support to future students without the parent support?
Show diversity, show inclusion. Let them know that no matter what, you're there, you're going to support them. Have signs in your classroom that show that you're safe spaces and show that it's okay to be different, even if you're not always accepted.
One of the things that PFLAG's hoping to do is start a speakers bureau. And I think that might be one small vehicle. If we went into the schools, if we have inquisitive parents not exactly saying, I embrace this and I want to work with it, but at least if we can get some parents to listen and we offer follow-up, if any of the parents would like to talk to one of us confidentially, it might be just one small thing that we can do to help.
So I just want to piggyback on what Amber said about watching what you say, right? Because same GLSEN survey, I really like it. I use it with teachers all the time because it's real students saying what's happening to them at school. 90% of students in the last survey, I think there were over 2,100 in the last survey, said that 90% of their teachers made at least one negative comment toward the LGBTQ community. Not necessarily directed at them, right? It could be, oh, Elliot Page came out. Everybody's trans these days. That is considered a negative comment. I mean, I consider it negative, but per the survey, it's considered a negative comment. So the students pick up on it. I mean, they are your little paparazzi. They see every single thing that you do, okay? And they see how you say things, right? Like I always my class, I always say, hey, y'all, which I'm from New York City and it still bothers me, but it's very important that I say, hey, y'all to my kids. And I never say boys and girls, guys and dolls, blah, blah, blah. Then I say, hey, y'all, right? And sometimes people ask me, and I'm like, I just think it includes everybody, whoever you are. It's hey, y'all, right? New York City Jewish doesn't really say that, but I do. But what do you call it? But my point being that even just having, if you're an English teacher, books on your ledge with representation, if you talk about figures in history and say, people think they were part of the LGBTQ community, showing Liberace as an American in your room. There's so many things you can do. And even in science and math, there are statistics you can be doing for LGBTQ communities. There's stuff about, I love to talk to science teachers about all the many different sexes that we have, that is not just male and female, there's like 96 of them. So, I mean, just statistically, that kind of stuff, this is ways that the kids know you're approachable, you're okay, and you're not saying, Elliot, Paige, everyone's trans these days, right?
I also think, I know when it comes out of your mouth, you own it. However, I think it's okay for a professional teacher, social worker to say, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have said that. I remember years ago when my youngest child was in Hebrew school, and she was a bad kid, I got it. But her young teacher said, well, your punishment is to write the Hebrew national anthem. And I called this young woman, I said, it would take my older daughter, my husband to do this. Perhaps you could give Beth a different punishment. And she said, oh, she was a young special ed teacher, and during the day she said, once you say it, it has to stick. And I said to her, I hope as you grow and mature, you'll change your thoughts about that. So.
Other questions? Any more from the Zoom? We have a, Tara?
You've said so many things that I want to comment on. I'm just so excited. One, to follow up on something you said, Andrea, about just the higher rates of graduation and attendance and everything, that I think it's important to point out that that is not specific to the LGBTQ youth, but that is for the entire student population, that when those policies are in place, everybody benefits, and not just the LGBTQ youth and their peers, but also the faculty as well. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then you also mentioned a little bit about just incorporating into the curriculum, how important that is. It's really the teachers and the school that sets the tone. And if you can incorporate all those examples into the curriculum, then it's just natural, it just flows. And then lastly, there are two school districts in the guide that I know, Andrea, you've worked with a lot, and you've talked a little bit about this. Half the problem or half the challenge is to get the policies in place. And then the other part is to enforce it in healthy, productive ways. So kudos to Christina and Red Clay, who have the policies in place, but also how can we help getting them to be enforced? So two-part question. If you could just speak to that journey to get the school districts on board, and then enforcing it. Thank you.
Yeah, I know this one. I don't know. I am a really loud speaker. I just want. But it's funny because there was something in here, and I don't remember what page it was, about Regulation 225, which I was on that committee and we lost. And for those of you that know what it was, we tried to make a statewide policy that would be inclusive of LGBTQ youth. And unfortunately, we lost. I don't know who remembers that. That was in 2018. And it was devastating. But one of the things I learned, which is really the answer to your question, is how often people just didn't understand what the issues were. Everybody kept talking to me about bathrooms. And I was like, she just goes. Like it nothing really, she just goes. Like that's what happens. I don't know why we're talking about bathrooms. And one of the things I had said at the time, she was 18, was, she's been going to bathrooms in schools her whole life and nothing has happened. you know? And so I don't know why we're talking about bathrooms. But what I want to talk to you about is if we didn't legally change her name, we wouldn't have gotten her diploma in her name. And that's really important to her as a graduate of the Delaware public school system. Now, we did change her name, but this is what I wanted to talk about. Where can we put kids' names? And people just didn't understand. When I started talking about sex ed classes, there were even LGBTQ people in the room who were part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual cohort. And they were like, oh, I never thought about that before for transgender people. So we need to get more of a presence out there so that people actually understand what the issues are, not the cisgender heterosexual issues, but the issues of the actual LGBTQ person. Because I was the mom and I was the educator and I was doing it all, you know? And so I think we have to get people out there. And I also tell districts we need to educate. You cannot just throw a policy down on a table without any education. And so as organizations like this, I'm putting us all on the spot, offer to educate. You know, go to a local school board if you know there's issues in the district and just say, hey, I can get you a panel of speakers. Would your board like to speak to a panel of speakers? I will come to anything. I drove from Newark tonight. So I will come anywhere. You know, I've gone to middle of Pennsylvania, like I will go. And some of these people will come with me too. They're great. So, you know, we have to get the word out that we're here and that we can talk to people just in a constructive way. And I think that that's what's really helpful, you know, the understanding piece. And I think Anita talks about that a lot. We don't want to make people be on the defensive, you know, and let me tell you, as a teacher, you know, you have 150 middle school kids and you're like, what? You know, so we don't want people to be on the defensive. We want to say, this is a safe space. Ask us anything. We'll answer anything. If it's inappropriate, I will let you know. And I will let you know why it's inappropriate. But you can still ask it. But I'm going to tell you it's inappropriate. And that's okay. Like set the ground rules for people.
That question, when you asked it, was like simultaneously so important and so hard to me, because one of the things that I say to parents so frequently is my lawyer magic wand doesn't allow me to change hearts and minds. Right? Like I can come in and make them do X, Y, and Z, and I can file a complaint and get this result, but I can't make that teacher like your kid. But I think what you said, Andrea, that's so important. And I think, again, just returning to one of the beautiful things about this guide is that it starts from the perspective that teachers do like kids and that parents love their kids. And that even if there's a knowledge gap, the overwhelming intentions of people are good. And if we make that safe space for these conversations and for the education, then I do believe that the mindsets will follow. But it has to be more than just a policy. Like you said, Andrea, it has to be something that is lived and experienced.
Please, yes.
This isn't really a question, but I just think back several years ago when I was very ignorant to all this, just what we're talking about. And, you know, we talk about required reading for students. I read the book Middlesex, which was a Pulitzer Prize winner. And, you know, that to me was an absolute aha moment when I realized that sex was not, you know, man, woman, and in between, and that was it. There were three. And I just learned so much, and it's written in such an empathetic manner that I'm just wondering if that should be like required reading for teachers.
So I will tell you that the book I recommend everywhere I go, whether it's parents. Oh, hello. Let me just grab that. I'm so sorry. She pointed and I grabbed. The one book that I do recommend a lot to parents, to grandparents, to teachers, because I think it's very manageable for them, is a book called The Gender Agenda. And if any of you know it, it was two parents. You actually don't know it. I believe they are male and female, but you don't really know throughout the book. And they decide they want to raise their kids without gender awareness and gender roles. And they realize how difficult that is in society. And so basically they wrote a blog and then they published the blog, which is the book. And it's about all these things that happen to them as they go into society, and even just their own biases. You know, they'll say, darn it, you know what I said to my kid today? And look at that. What does that say about women? You know? And so I actually find that to be a book that a lot of and I love Middlesex, trust me, I agree, eye-opening, it was heavy, it was amazing. I learned a ton from Middlesex. But the gender agenda I like because everyone can see themselves in it. Like they can say, I've said that before. Oh yeah, my parents always do say that. Oh yeah, the teacher says that to the kid. You know, like they can see themselves in it. So I love that recommendation if anybody is interested.
Additional questions? We have, all right.
I'd like to say one other thing. I think that we are really focusing today on teachers, but all schools have child study teams. And I think the people on the child study teams need some attention also. Their focus, of course, is special ed and disabilities. I taught social workers, graduate social workers for Rutgers before we moved to Delaware. And I was troubled by the fact that they were kind of mediocre. You know, when I was a social worker, we marched down Broad Street with Martin Luther King and we were advocating. And these social workers are okay, but they don't have the heart, and we have to teach them that. It's incumbent on us because they can be a real resource if we do it right.
I work with several social workers, so I feel like I have to stick up for them. They have a lot of heart. I love our social workers, but your point is well taken that it does take a village, right? Beyond the teacher, beyond the student, beyond the social worker. And we get really on social worker. Yes.
Timing is everything.
But it starts with all of us in this room, right? You know, every school board election in Delaware that passes, I am just, you know, heartbroken because it takes a lot more than just dropping your kid at school and saying, you know, I'm doing my part, right? Like it really does take all of us. And so, you know, for that new gay teacher that was talking on the Zoom, you know, what do I do for my students? I hope that he has someone in the community that's willing to come to the, you know, after school special, whatever, and be a part of that community. Because I'm telling y'all, teachers and social workers, school staff, administrators can't do it all by themselves. We lean way too heavily on our schools, and particularly for our most diverse students who aren't necessarily going to have those role models in their classrooms.
And I want to add that we also have to educate the cafeteria ladies and the janitors, so we're all speaking the same language. And you know, if you know better, you do better. And some of these folks don't know. I want to keep that in mind.
Question back there?
So can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
So I just want, this might be a very specific question, but I go to a charter school, so it's obviously a lot different. And sometimes I feel like it's harder for me to be able to do stuff because of that charter, because I feel like parents have more control. And obviously in Sussex County, those parents aren't obviously gonna be all accepting and everything. So I was just wondering if you had any advice or any steps to be taken in schools that are like charter schools or even private schools where there isn't these very specific protections that these students have because of those stipulations like the charter, and that it's not, the whole funding doesn't come just from the state.
Has anyone had experience in the charter or private schools?
Well, they're two very different animals. So the difference in charter schools is often that the school doesn't think that the same protections apply. but they do. So I think that's really, that's the first most important thing to say is that the Know Your Rights Guide still very much applies to you. Again, then that kicks us to the hearts and minds question, right? So like, okay, this applies to me. I have this right. How am I going to enforce it? And that goes to the situation that you're in and the, you know, is this a situation where we are trying to work together to move things in the right direction? Or are we moving more to like an OCR complaint or, you know, calling the ACLU or calling my office or something like that? So are we taking a more adversarial approach, a more cooperative approach? Is obviously dependent on the situation, but in a charter school, the same rights do apply. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Private schools can be a little bit more difficult and not all of the same rights apply. There's a lot that's dependent on whether the private school receives federal funds. Many private schools do. There are exceptions based on religion. So even if the school is receiving federal funds, there may be a religious exception. And so things can be more tricky there and you may have to do a little bit more finessing, for lack of a better word, depending on what the situation is and what the specific private schools, you know, financial and religious background is. Any other?
We'll take one last question.
Yeah, one last question then actually, if it's okay, we have our person from NASW who wanted to say a couple words about how they're going to use it for social workers.
Certainly.
Hello. Is it required by law for all teachers to receive gender language training? Because there's the state. So how do they get around that? Because we're paid by the state as employees. So how do schools get around that law saying that it's something 90? It was a revision 90 that all state employees, well, it says state employees need to have gender training. It's very fuzzy to me on what that
Anyone
law
aware of
is.
this?
I'm not familiar with it. I'm really interested in it, so I'll have to look.
If you'll email me, I'll do it.
I'm very fuzzy on this, but I know that there's wiggle room there.
I know what she's talking about. It was a reformed law that had just been done. Senate Bill written in 2013.
From 2013.
But they did a rewrite and revision of it.
Okay.
Last year.
Clearly something to take a look at here. Yes. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't have an
Michelle.
answer for you right now, but I'm interested in it. Thanks
Right.
for bringing it up.
More homework for the ACLU.
Yeah, and then we're very excited.
Please.
Our friend from the National Association of Social Workers Delaware chapter is here. We were just chatting about social workers. So she's here to talk a little bit about how they're planning to use the guide.
Hi, everyone. My name is Razia Cooper, and I'm the engagement coordinator at the NASW Delaware chapter. And I'm really excited to be here. I walked in right on time. I'm happy to be here. But I think that the most important thing that I want to share with each and every one of you guys as educators, that knowing your students' rights and advocating for those rights allows them to find you as a safe space. And that's the most important thing. As social workers, we talk a lot about self-determination and compassion and partnering with people to do their best work from their best place. So knowing your right, knowing their pronouns, knowing how they want to be addressed, knowing that gender affirming pronoun that may make them feel a little bit more comfortable, or that name that they may want to be addressed as, allows you as an educator to become a safe space for them and allows them to know that they can look to you for help and they can talk to you and they can open up about things that may be happening to them that they may not have anyone else to talk to about that. So that's all I wanted to share. As a social worker, we lead with compassion. So I know my educators are going to do the same thing. And at our chapter, we're going to spread the word. We're going to spread the word. It's important to spread the word and to educate. People are not going to do the work if they don't know how to do it. So that's all.
Thank you. But this wraps up our panel, and I'd like to thank all of you for your insights, and this has been tremendous. Thank you. We're going to take a very short break and then come back for the second half. Thank you.
Hi, you all. I'm Ron Collins, and I'm so delighted to just make a few preliminary remarks at tonight's incredible event. Again, I want to just echo our special thanks to all of our sponsors, and particularly the Lewes Public Library, Becca Lowe here, for all the incredible work they do throughout the year and keeping the First Amendment alive and robust in the state of Delaware. So please join with me in thanking the folks who raised money for the library. And this library is able to do what it does because it needs your support. So please don't be shy. And also a special thank you to the folks at the Delaware ACLU and particularly Melissa and our friend here for all of the wonderful work they do. I mean, Mike and Melissa and others have just put together an enormous amount of work. And again, a special shout out to not only the Delaware ACLU, but Camp Rehoboth for all the work that they're doing. We're so delighted to have them. Any social justice movement needs at least three things if it's going to change the world, all right? It needs information, it needs inspiration, it needs activism. And when you put those three words together, the name Marjorie Rowland comes to mind. This is a remarkable book. I want you to know that I taught constitutional law for 40 years and I did not know this story. It is remarkable that people in our world don't know this story. And but for the fact two non-lawyers to tell the rest of us who teach this day in and day out what we didn't know is a remarkable book that Margaret and Karen have written. I strongly urge you to purchase it. You can purchase it today. Is it $15? Is that correct? I believe $20? $20, which is less than the amount you would pay if you bought it online. So I strongly urge you, you can purchase it. The way you support writers, I'm a writer and they're writers, is with your pocketbook. So it's a wonderful book. I strongly urge you to read it. It will inspire you. It will activate you. It will inform you. And so tonight, we're really fortunate to have as part of this program, these two authors to join us tonight, as I said, Margaret, Karen. And with that, David, Garrett, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I feel honored to have collaborated with these two wonderful authors. And just a couple basics before we get underway. There are copies of the latest issue of Letters from Camp Rehoboth over along the Camp Rehoboth table over there. And you'll want to go to page 22. That's my article. And this article happens to be focused on this book. So you're going to probably learn more from our conversation over the next few minutes than you'll get from the article. But it's important to make all the connections. And as Lisa and others shared earlier, Camp Rehoboth stands for Creating a More Positive Rehoboth. That's what we're all about. I'm on the board of directors. I'm also the proud father of a trans daughter. My daughter came home before her transition in December of 2010 and said, "I've got some great news for you, Dad. You've always wanted a daughter, now you're going to have one." I was not happy. I struggled. I wrestled. Out of it came a pouring out of love. I always, from the time both of my children were born, I said, whatever happens to them in life, I'm going to be there as their father. And she is now 12 years after her transition, living a happy life in, of all places, Las Vegas. But she's happy, and because of that, I'm happy. Okay, let's get down to the focus of this evening. The book is entitled Mad River, Marjorie Rowland and the Quest for LGBTQ Teachers Rights. Now, I would like to ask the two of you to share a little bit about who you are, where you come from, how the two of you ever met and decided to collaborate on Marjorie's story.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for sharing your story. Obviously, still is very, yes. Yeah, yeah. And thank you to Mike and the ACLU and to Ron for instigating all of this. And we are so glad to be here and to be with you. Thank you for having us. My name is Margaret Nash, and I am working on figuring out how to be retired because I'm not quite retired yet. But I officially have retired from being a professor at the University of California at Riverside, where I was an educational historian, teaching classes on things like the history of school segregation and desegregation, history of church and state and schooling, gender and education, that kind of thing. And my research has mostly been on the history of women's education from the 18th century to the near present. And I had just started doing work on the history of, on LGBTQ educational history. I have an article on, a very fun article on the history of college drag, should you be interested in looking that up. It's very fun. But also, and this is where our work begins to overlap, an article on the history of purges of college students and faculty in the 1940s. And that is an overlap with Karen's work, which might be an inroad to our working on this.
Okay, thank you. I want to just second all the things that Margaret mentioned at the beginning, and also at the public library here in Lewes. The panelists who came in the first session, it was a great, wonderful, informative session. So thank you all for the work you are doing. I'm Karen Graves. I was a secondary school mathematics teacher for the first part of my career for about 9 years. And then I went back to graduate school to study history of education and landed in a liberal arts college in Central Ohio, Denison University, and taught there in their educational studies department for almost 30 years. I too recently retired. December of last year. And so also trying to figure out the transition from all of that work to till now. About shortly after 2000, almost 20 years, I would say, I started to look, I also started looking at history of gender issues in the US school system. And about 20 years ago or so, I started to look at the history of LGBTQ teachers. That at that point was still a very much unexplored territory in the history of education. And so it was exciting to be one of the, in the first wave of people trying to understand that history. And I worked on a book that came out in 2009, And They Were Wonderful Teachers, Florida's Purge of Gay and Lesbian Teachers, which looks at the worst time in the 20th century for LGBTQ people, the post-World War II, Cold War, 1950s, 1960s era. And although the purges had started before in the 1940s, as Maggie's wonderful article makes clear, they really got speed. They picked up speed in the 1950s, and the state of Florida had a long-running legislative investigation committee that was in place for 9 years. It started to go after civil rights activists, and it became mired in court cases and so forth. In the meantime, flipped over to start to pursue LGBTQ teachers, professors, students. They were heavily funded from the state. They pursued that work. They didn't just stumble over people and then discover them and then boot them out. They tracked people down, and they did it relentlessly, and all kinds of abuse of civil rights and so forth. So I spent some time working on that story. And then when the book was out, I decided to start looking at a different period, the 1970s, when some things were starting to turn around for some LGBTQ teachers, and came across Justice Brennan's dissent on the Marjorie Rowland case, came across a couple of brief secondary literature references to Marjorie Rowland's case and was having breakfast at a conference with my good friend Margaret Nash and telling her about, what are you working on? What are you working on? Told her about what I was working on and told her that Marjorie Rowland was still around. She was in Tucson, Arizona, and that probably this work would mean that I would need to interview her. And I must confess, I said, I don't really like doing interviews. And she said, well, you know what? I love doing interviews. And so we started thinking, why don't we work on this one together? And so we started that work in about 2016. And now the book is out. So.
Well, if you could share with the Zoom audience as well as the audience in front of us, how do you think Marjorie Rowland's case resonates today? I mean, this was back in the 1970s. Has anything changed?
Would it be okay before we answer that if we tell people a little bit about what Marge Rowland's story is? Okay, so Marjorie Rowland had been an English teacher for a while, and then she, in Ohio, and then she went back to school to get credentialed as a guidance counselor. She was in her first year of her brand new job as a school guidance counselor in Dayton, Ohio. You just have to love it. It's the Mad River School District. I couldn't have asked for a better title for the book, but Mad River. Let's see. So in that first autumn, her first fall, two different students, unknown to each other, came to see her separately to say that they had that they were gay. This was the fall of 1973, I think, right? And not 74, and not an easy time to be gay in Dayton, Ohio, or much of anywhere else. And so each of these students had come out to their parents, and their parents had not reacted well at all. The parents were livid. The parents were about to kick them out. The students were really struggling. So Rowland said to the secretary for her department, she named these two students and said to the secretary, if either of these students need to see me, even if they don't have an appointment, let them in. So remember that she gave the name of the students to the secretary, because this is going to create a problem for her. So one of the students, their parent came to see Marge because they had heard from the student that Marge Rowland was being supportive of the student. So the parent comes in and starts yelling, and Rowland is trying to convince the parent to accept their student, and the parent is not having any of it, and it's loud and it's acrimonious, to say the least. The parent leaves, and Rowland knows this is going to escalate. So she goes down the hall to the assistant principal and lets the assistant principal know that this had happened. And they're talking about all of this, and in the course of that conversation, Rowland comes out to the assistant principal as being bisexual. Rowland goes back to her office, and moments later, the principal calls her in because the assistant principal had gone right down the hall to the principal. So the principal calls Rowland in and says, no, we cannot have a bisexual teacher in our school. Would you like to resign, or would you like to be fired? And she says, I'm not resigning. She goes back to her office, and by the end of the day, she's called into a meeting with the school superintendent, who again makes that very kind offer. I'm being sarcastic. And she again says, no, I am not resigning. So she was, I'll give a shorter version of the story here. By the end of the school year, she was on a one-year contract, so she couldn't exactly be fired, but by the end of the year, her contract was not renewed. She then filed suit for wrongful termination, and it took her 6 long years to even get a trial. But yes, But by the end of that 6 years, she finally got a trial and she actually won at the lower level. The jury had agreed that she had been wrongfully terminated, that she had been a good guidance counselor, because in this trial, the district argued, well, she wasn't fired because she was bisexual. She was fired because, remember, she gave the name of those 2 students to the secretary? She violated student confidentiality. Rowland and her lawyers, of course, argued she was acting in the best interest of the student. She hadn't broadcast their names. She had given it just to the secretary. Okay, so she wins at the lower court level, and then the district appeals and she loses on appeal. And then the case goes up to the US Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court, it takes 4 justices to move a case forward, and only 2 thought that it should be heard. But in spite of her, this is why one of the reasons why nobody knows Rowland's story is because her case wasn't heard by the Supreme Court. But it is here where her case gains national significance.
And just a little bit of context before that, in 1964, the ACLU started to represent LGBTQ people who were being dismissed from their jobs. 10 years later, in 1974, the National Education Association also put forward a resolution to stand with LGBTQ educators. And so that's why we start to see in the late 60s and early 70s, some people who are being dismissed fighting the dismissals in court. And so Rowland belongs to that generation. And the court had actually turned down, I believe, 4 other teachers' cases every single time that reached their docket. And so her case came along in 1985. Finally, the appeal reached the Supreme Court. That's when they turned that down. Although they didn't hear the case, as they hadn't heard any other case, Justice Brennan wrote the dissent. Justice Thurgood Marshall also signed the dissent. And in this dissent, for the first time, you get a United States Supreme Court justice making the argument that LGBTQ people have First Amendment rights, freedom of speech about their status, 14th Amendment rights, equal protection under the law. Brennan wrote that Marjorie Rowland's case was perfect for the Supreme Court. The facts at the jury trial had been clear. The lower courts were in disarray. There had been a patchwork of opinions back and forth a little bit. He thought the time was right. And in his dissent, then he lays out an argument that other courts later on will take up. They'll basically use that framework when we finally get equal rights pushed through Lawrence v. Texas in 2003, marriage equality, other employment cases, and so forth. And so very basically, if I could say a word or two, the dissent says that Rowland had a substantial First Amendment free speech claim. Basically, it's the standard argument for free speech cases. You cannot condition public employment on a basis that infringes free speech. And so when you have a situation like this, you've got the government in the school curtailing the speech of the employee, Rowland. And so there's a 2-pronged test. First, you have to decide, was this speech about a matter of public concern? And when Brennan wrote that, yes, this is addressing a matter of public concern, he's in effect pushing forward, making a substantial claim for the gay rights movement at that time, that this is something we need to care about. The second part of the test is that even if you have a matter of public concern, you can't disrupt the school environment, and she very clearly had not done that. So from Brennan's perspective, it was a slam dunk. Yes, of course, there are free speech issues here. He also said she has 14th Amendment equal protection rights. And just very briefly, to make a claim for equal protection, the first thing the court will do, you very well may know, is to determine the degree of scrutiny. And on equal protection cases, if you're Marjorie Rowland, you want the court to have to consider this under strict scrutiny. That means the school district, that is the government, has to show you a really convincing argument for why they're taking this action. Most cases are heard on the lowest level, the rational basis standard. So all you'd have to do is the school would only have to give a rational basis reason for taking their action. But if it's elevated to strict scrutiny, it really is going to make their job that much more difficult. There are 2 ways you can get to strict scrutiny. Brennan said Marjorie Rowland's case met both of them. So first, you can elevate to strict scrutiny if the court considers you part of a suspect class. That is, a group of people who historically have been discriminated against, sustained hostility that is so severe that they have been basically politically powerless to advance their rights in the public arena. That would suggest that the actions against them reflect prejudice rather than rational thought. Normally, equal protection cases, race always is the suspect class. Brendan was suggesting, you know what? LGBTQ people might be a suspect class as well. He actually went on to say then, but even if that failed, he thought this case was so clear that it probably should pass even on the rational basis level. But that's another point. The other route to strict scrutiny is if the case involves a fundamental constitutional right. And Brennan said this case meets that bar as well. He points to some courts already acknowledging for LGBTQ people right to privacy, right to freedom of expression, and he put this in with that group. And so just wrapping this part up, the fact that he's saying LGBTQ issues are a public interest, that LGBTQ people might be a suspect class, that these are fundamental rights, coming from a Supreme Court justice in 1985 was a significant step forward.
Your question, so that's a little bit about Rowland's story, and we'd be happy to tell you far more about Marjorie Rowland and her case if you want to know more about it. Your question was about why does this resonate today? And I think one of the reasons is that so few of these stories are known. Marge Rowland was so courageous. She went through hell to fight for her rights and the rights of other LGBTQ teachers. And she wasn't alone. There were other teachers, as Karen said, that other cases that had come forward that had also not been heard. But almost none of these stories are known, including the stories of the teachers in Karen's first book, and they were wonderful teachers in Florida. We just don't know that history very much. And I think it resonates today because this is another period when teachers are under attack, when LGBTQ teachers and their allies are under attack for standing up for rights, for standing up for the kids. And I think that it is important to know this history, to know that we've been through some version of this before, where teachers who are fighting for these causes today are not alone. We are standing on the shoulders of people like Marge Rowland, I'm losing my train of thought here, but knowing that there's this history, I think, can help us feel less alone in the present, to know that there are others who have fought these battles too.
I'll take a run at that as well, if I can. When I start my beginning history of education course, which I taught for many, many years, this is kind of the question we look at. So why does this history matter to us today? And we use a very simple 3-part triangular analysis and basically said, what we need to do when we look at any school history, education history, is to see what was the society like at the time we're talking about? What's the political economic context like? What are the demographics like? How do the institutions work? Try to put ourselves into that environment. And then we need to think about, okay, what's the dominant ideology? What are the major ideas that people, how do they see the world? How are those things interacting? And then we'll pull the school out and put it over here. So to understand what's going on in school, you have to understand what are the other institutions like? How are they operating? That has a major impact on what happens in school. What are the general guiding ideologies? Obviously, it has a major impact on what's going on in school. And we hope, of course, that what goes on in school affects both of those other sectors. If you do that work historically, you start to practice, you start to get good on trying to analyze what's going on with the current school policy. Because these things are very complex, obviously. And so if you can practice on the historical part, then you can maybe get your chops and you can go ahead and tackle what's going on today. So that very study of trying to figure out, well, how did this work in the past? How are these things influencing each other? Helps us here. And if you look at the question from another angle and think about what teachers mean or school workers mean to the larger LGBTQ movement and have meant, what education means to that movement and has meant, it's a real special case because teachers are looked upon obviously as they're bringing up the next generation. They are significant players in that. And so whatever the society is arguing about, whatever they're concerned about, whatever rights they're trying to withhold, will tell you what that society wants its school to be doing. And so teachers historically have been under strict public surveillance. That's also connected to the fact that it has been a traditionally female sector of the economy for a long, long time. And so whatever people thought about women in 1840, they attached to teachers often. It's the fact that, you know, it's a tax supported institution. So people will argue, well, we're a stakeholder here. We need to have some surveillance about what's going on and so forth. So when the gay rights movement was just starting to have anti-discrimination laws in the late 1970s, when people, with a backlash to that, people went after the teachers. They held them up as, among all other workers, the ones we have to keep an eye on. Right? That was in place in some states, the fact that you couldn't be LGBTQ and be a teacher, until 2003 with the Lawrence v. Texas Supreme Court decision. It took until 2003 to finally abolish the remaining laws, that criminalized LGBTQ status. And so certainly if you're in a state where your status is criminalized, you can't be a teacher. You can't be a public school teacher. Okay? 2003, before that legally is taken off the books, not off all the state codes, but basically off the books. And it's not until 2020 with Bostock v. Clayton County that we get the same kind of sweeping argument regarding LGBTQ employment. Interestingly, that was not a constitutional argument. They relied on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act because of sex status. But in public schools now, as long as that law is honored on the ground where we work, we finally have protections against employment discrimination like that. So it's a relatively recent situation where there's some legal argument to protect LGBTQ teachers in their jobs.
That is a tremendously fascinating story about Marjorie. And in conjunction with that, what would the two of you say have been, in spite of the fact that the Supreme Court never actually heard the case, what would you say would be the positive outcomes from Marjorie Rowland having gotten that far in the legal process?
We trace in the book the influence that dissent has had on marriage equality laws, on the right to serve in the United States military cases, and on people's acceptance as teachers and so forth. And it's had a tremendous influence. It's quoted a number of times. And basically, Brennan provided the framework there. So that is, I think, the major point I would make on that.
Anything else, Margaret?
You got it.
Okay. Now, my follow-up question to that is Marjorie Rowland aware of the positive outcomes from her case?
I think she is, but she also is very humble about it. She, when we approached her, she was shocked that anybody cared about her case, that anybody knew about it, that anybody wanted to hear about it. I think she had some sense of how her case, how that dissent had been used in other cases, but I don't think she took much credit for it. She's just such a humble person who just wants the work to be done and wasn't looking for any kind of credit or anything like that. So I think she was pretty shocked that we wanted to write a book about her. But she's also very proud of that dissent.
Yeah. You had mentioned in previous comments here about Florida cases and the abuse of civil rights And we're all relieved to know that that has changed in Florida. Sarcasm. Sarcasm. I'm not going to ask what challenges remain because there are too many. We don't have enough time this evening to go through that. But how do you see what do you see as one of the primary roles of educators in diversity, inclusion, acceptance? How can a teacher today truly accept the mission of affecting in a positive way their students' lives?
It's a little question trying to. And the previous panel went a long way toward answering that too. That was a wonderful panel. And then they're full of great and concrete suggestions of things that educators, teachers, but also social workers and counselors and administrators can do. So thank you for any of those, the panelists who are still in the room. That was wonderful.
Let me talk about a few things, see if I come circle around to the question. One of the things I think that's helpful to think about is that the work of education writ large is always ongoing. It's not like, you know, you're in a classroom or a district and you get it right, and then there it is, it's right. Thank goodness we fixed that. And it's just part of the process that you always have to be engaged in the work of education. Same thing for little d democracy. You always have to keep going. You always have to keep vigilant. You always, it's never finished in that sense. Same thing for academic freedom, guarding academic freedom, which is quite limited in K-12, but you always have to keep an eye on it. And I think teachers, K-12 teachers, need to be examples for their students on those principles. They need to model civic participation. They need to model constitutional rights. They need to, when they're fighting for their own rights, they are a model to students of standing up and guarding those constitutional rights. Margaret A, Chicago teacher from the early 20th century who is credited with leading the beginnings of teacher unions. And this is at a time when the majority of elementary school teachers were women, most not married, because the common pattern was that if you were married, then you would lose your job. Didn't have pensions. And so had a lot of good reasons to want to unionize. And she's putting this work forward in the city of Chicago, a time of a big labor battles, of course. And she gave a speech in 1904 at the National Education Association, one of the first women to actually speak, to address the group. And one of the things she says in that talk is, how does she put it? The same things that are of interest to the child are of interest to the teacher as well. The same things that stop the education of the child, the same things that get in the way of the teacher's right to do their job ultimately affect the education of the students. And so there is this legacy of really, if teachers are not allowing free thought, free expression, human dignity, respect for all of their students, it's hard to imagine how the culture itself is going to put that forward if the school is not doing it, I think.
You mentioned Florida, and I assume that's because of the Don't Say Gay laws that are so, infamous for. And, those laws are proliferating. And I want to say that even where there are not, and this is answering the question about what can educators do, is fighting against these kinds of policies, being activists on this score. Even when those laws aren't in place, way too many districts are using district level policy that says you're not allowed to discuss any controversial, divisive, religious, or political issues in classrooms. And how does that teach us citizenship? How does that promote any of our the democratic values? There is a story out of Ohio, which is where I live now and where Karen did live until a year ago. and maybe you've heard about this story, I don't know. A teacher, this is just last spring, a teacher was wearing a rainbow bracelet that had contact information for a suicide prevention hotline. And a high school student asked the teacher about the bracelet. And because the student expressed interest, the teacher gave the child that bracelet, and that teacher was fired for violating the district policy about, it was, too political. Across the country, districts are telling teachers to take down safe zone and safe space signs, again, saying it's too political. So you don't have to have a don't say gay law in order to quash free speech and in order to quash the help that these children need. So for all of us, educators and not, I would urge paying attention to what the district policies are. I mean, pay attention to the state level too, of course, but local districts have a lot of power over what is happening in schools and in classrooms. So that would be one place that I would say that one thing that educators need to be aware of. And if your district is great, good, reinforce that with your local school board that yes, we're so glad that our policy still permits free speech. And if your neighboring district is bad, approach that school board, talk to local school boards about these policies, whether they're good or bad policies. Let them know where you stand. Let them know that people are paying attention to this, that this matters. Because so much of what local school boards do, far too people pay attention to. So pay attention and get your neighbors to pay attention and make sure people know where you can get the email addresses of your school board and all of that.
And I'll circle back around to the state level legislation that's erupting again. We've seen a lot of this before. We've seen these laws tend to be written with very vague language. So the point about it's hard to know what's going to trip you up. Justice Thurgood Marshall referred in a different case to the sword of Damocles that just hangs above you and you never know when it's going to drop and get you. And so I think the line is, the power of that is not that it drops, but that it hangs, that it's over your head and you have to watch where you step and it just has a chilling response to people watching every step they take. We've seen that before. We've seen these laws as they're being written now give a lot of parental oversight, stepping on teacher authority. Certainly teachers need to work with communities, with families, with students on all these issues. Those are all legitimate claims, but the laws are written in a way that's really giving a lot of power, I think, to parents to say, what about you talked about this? And now the school district has to use its own resources limited to defend against those actions as it's written there. And another pattern that we've seen before, in the language of these bills, they're putting forward the myth, basically, that LGBTQ people are, supposedly recruiting children, and this is all to protect the children. We've seen those claims before. Some things that are different now. In the last 4 or 5 decades, we have a great deal of research, a great deal of literature, a great deal of knowledge throughout the academic disciplines on human sexuality and gender identity. That wasn't there 50 or 60 years ago when these purges were tearing through the country. We have, as a result of that, and the first panel just kept making this point about we have knowledge. Okay? As a result of that, lots of institutions are nowhere near where they used to be. Now we have the law in a better position, at least in terms of criminal status and other kinds of civil rights. We have educational institutions. The National Education Association in the 50s didn't help the teachers. In Florida, they worked against the teachers. Since 1974, they've been with the teachers, American Federation of Teachers as well. Principal and superintendent associations on board. School board associations on board. The American Educational Research Association and other scholarly organizations in the field of education and medicine, and on and on and on. Social policy issues. We have those groups of people. We have the media paying attention now. None of these things were in place in the 1950s to help the teachers who were being purged at that time. And so I think those things are really important to remember.
Absolutely. I think one of the important things that everybody in this room and everybody on the Zoom telecast needs to take ownership of is that we need to dictate the language that's being used. We can't stand by and allow somebody to label us or to accuse us of grooming our children for all sorts of perversion. That's getting so old. So we need to change the language and dictate what language is used at school board meetings, in Dover, at the Legislative Hall, and we need to reconstruct the pattern of the words that we use to make it conducive to bringing our children in and letting them be who they want to be. And we need to cross lines. And I'm not talking, yes, politically, but I'm also talking within the spectrum of LGBTQ. I'm a straight man. When my daughter came home and informed me that she was going to become a daughter, I scheduled a dinner reservation with a good friend of mine who was gay. And we met for dinner and I said, Brian, tell me what all this transgender stuff is about. And he just sat there and shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know. As a straight man, we use that acronym LGBTQ all the time. And I was under the illusion that all the L's and G's got along together and that the L's and G's knew what the B's and T's were all about. No. So we need to reach across the acronym and the spectrum of our own sexual orientations and gender identities and walk into that boardroom arm in arm. Educate one another, educate the people who hold the decision-making powers, and maybe out of that, there will be some good that happens. I want to switch our focus a little bit. When Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, Justice Clarence Thomas listed some other laws or other decisions that he thought it might be fair to review. Tell me your take on that. In two sentences, no.
Anything could happen. But I think there are two, at least, justices now who absolutely would go after LGBTQ civil rights that have been established. But I take heart in the Bostock decision because Justice Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion. I believe Justice Kavanaugh also signed on to the majority opinion, and Justice Roberts signed on to the, and they pared it down. They weren't taking on the constitutional issues, so that's not going to be a whole lot of help. That was the case that found job discrimination against LGBTQ people unconstitutional, basically, but not because of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. They zeroed in on that because of sex language in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and made the argument that if you apply that thinking, that thinking would apply to LGBTQ people as well. So if they stick with that, if they're consistent, that might help going forward, but I don't know.
I'm not that optimistic about the Supreme Court. I think it's quite possible that our right to marry will be overturned, but that is not the end of the story. I think then the next thing is then, Congress can pass laws. I think that is possible. I think, most polls show that most people are in favor of same-sex marriage, that most people don't want that to be denied. So I think if the Supreme Court does overturn Obergefell, that our next route will be federal legislation. And I think there will be a strong battle for that. I think, so I'm saying this by way of saying, if the Supreme Court does this, be mad, be sad, and then, we pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and prepare for the battle in the next, on the next ground, or the next Congress, right? Exactly. So there's always the next step.
Yeah, that's important to keep in mind. Even in spite of some of the setbacks that we experience, that's not the end of the story.
Yeah, I think that actually is one of the great lessons of Rowland's story. I mean, she lost. She didn't get her job back. She never worked in a school again. Her case was not heard by the Supreme Court. On the face of it, her story is a very sad one. It's maddening. And there were good consequences from it. That dissent did lead to the basis for civil rights for LGBTQ people in all kinds of arenas. Good things can come out of bad things too.
Okay, we're at the point of the evening with the second chapter of this discussion that we're going to field questions from the Zoom community as well as within this room. Does anybody have any questions for Margaret or Karen?
I can start off with one from the Zoom. It says, I am learning from many teachers in the public school system to be careful about going against the political grain of the educational system. How can I be an effective advocate without potential risk of losing our job for other reasons?
That's a real question, and it's been a real question for a long time. If you don't know Vanessa Siddle Walker's work, her most recent book is The Lost Education of Horace Tate, but she has a series of 3 books where she looks at the role that African-American teachers played in the 1940s and 50s in pushing toward desegregation. They had to fly under the radar. If they were known to be working toward that as leaders in their community, they would have been fired like that. People were fired for belonging to the NAACP. So teachers for a long time have to figure out, how do you do your work with integrity in a way that keeps you there? It's a conservative institution. And I don't think anyone can tell anybody else exactly how they read that on the ground. But I think we can take inspiration from teachers of the past who have faced those decisions. And, some were able to do remarkable work and keep their jobs. Others weren't able to keep their jobs. But the lessons of the past, and we have lots and lots of them, I think can be helpful just to help us think through.
A book that might be helpful is by Catherine Connell or Connell, Connell. And it's, I'm not going to remember the name of the book either. It's in the bibliography, I think. But it's about gay teachers. And she talks about the different choices that gay teachers have to make. And she refers to teachers taking on being either knitters, splitters, or quitters. And the knitters are people who try to include their identity in with their personal identity in with their professional identity, and how hard that is, and in some places and not so hard in others. And the splitters try to keep them completely separate, as though their personal identity and their professional identity are in 2 different realms. And some that works very well, and for others that bifurcation of themselves is painful. And some of them then become quitters who then, and I don't mean, she doesn't mean quitters as in that that's, you know, a bad thing, but it's that it cannot sustain that in that school system and then find other ways to push for change from outside the system. So it's a tough question and everybody has to make their personal decision and that will change over time as your life situation changes and as your district changes too. But be proud of whatever you do along the way that is taking the movement forward
And
for
I'm
as long
thinking,
as you can.
sorry, I'm thinking of another reference. Kevin Kumashiro has a number of publications on this very question. And some of them you can just find online if you just probably Google his name, Kumashiro. And he has addressed a number of points about this question, and a couple of them resonate with what David said earlier. You know, frame the conversation. Don't let people put words in your mouth or don't let them get away with things that are not accurate. Frame the conversation actively. And for teachers, we heard this earlier this evening, you know, how is what you're doing in the classroom holding up the school mission? How is it holding up the standards of what your discipline is that you're teaching? How is this advancing the education of your students? And the second thing that I wrote down that Kevin Kumashiro talks about, which I think David also mentioned, was just finding community where you can, uniting across shared and common values or objectives. And remember, you know, this latest wave in 2021, it started with the attack on learning about the history of race in the United States, learning about so-called attack on so-called CRT. It's not even really that, but you know, the attack on teaching history, basically. And so there's a lot of common ground here, and I think working together is critical.
Just as a follow-up, the resource that Margaret was talking about from Catherine Connell, the book is entitled Schools Out, Gay and Lesbian Teachers in the Classroom. That's from Oakland University of California Press.
And we have a question over here.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative. My question kind of goes to the belief that I strongly hold that in order to change behavior, we have to understand its motivation and its function. And I think a number of us in this room know individual administrators or superintendents who would advance some of the don't talk politics, nothing too divisive in the classroom policies. But then we've also all seen, not just in Delaware, but across the country, school board meetings where a very angry, misinformed minority overwhelms the school board. And I'm curious in your research if you see kind of one factor or the other driving these policies, because I think that that informs how we try to counteract them. Does that make sense?
Before answering that question, there's a video that's gone viral. I don't know if you've seen it, about somebody who's pro LGBTQ that was just taking down a city council meeting with, you know, how dare you call yourselves caring about children? How dare you call yourselves Christian? And I mean, she's just amazing. So yes, the impassioned speeches are definitely on both sides, although it seems like they're more on the negative side. Exactly. And I do think, you know, since the 1980s, conservatives have made a concerted effort to be on school boards and to get groups and conservative churches send people to school board meetings. And, you know, liberals don't do that so much. Liberal churches don't rally people to go to the school board meetings. And, you know, maybe that's something to think about. Why is that? Why is there such a difference? But there is a more of a compulsion, it seems like, on the part of more conservative people to make sure that their views are there at school board meetings. And I just don't think there's that same general kind of compulsion on the parts of more liberal people. And we have to figure out how to change that equation.
And I think you're right at the root maybe of all of it is fear. Things are changing. I'm afraid of that. Things, I don't understand things. I'm afraid of that. I'm losing a grip on the world as I see it. I'm afraid of that. And I think it's no accident that the success of using the schools, the teachers, the curriculum, the students as pawns, which again, historically we see from time to time in a battle over raw politics. There's no accident, I think, that that followed the worst years of the pandemic when people were losing so much under such stress, children learning from home, families getting a view of the school like they've never had before and so forth. And so I think to the extent you can be with people and just listen and then try to, again, reframe and point in positive directions and counter misconceptions and so forth. To the extent people can do that, perhaps could be helpful.
Yes, we have a question over here.
This is so interesting. I love it. So you talked about the Bostock case a little bit and how it applies to Title VII, and they use the Title VII language. So a little bit louder. Oh, Title VII Bostock case, what they talked about before. So my question to you is, have people been trying, and I know locally they've been trying, but nationally to use that for students as well? That if transgender status is part of Title VII and part of sex equality for adults, wouldn't it therefore mean for Title IX, it's the case for students as well, which is what some people have been trying to do here somewhat unsuccessfully. And I just wondered if you knew anything about that, or because I liked how you talked about like even the dissent was interesting and using that language. So I think people are starting to use that language for kids, and I wondered if you had heard anything about it.
I don't know, sorry.
But it's a great question and something that'll be interesting to pay attention to. Yeah, thank you.
I think that will be in Margaret and Karen's next book. Any Zoom questions? No? Okay. Well, I think we're pretty well set for the evening. Thank you so much.
1 second, I wanted to do two things. Number one, when I did introductions earlier, I forgot to also mention Tara Sheldon, who planned a whole lot of this program. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you. And then I'm also supposed to remind everybody, we have these fantastic books for sale over here. So $20 to get your piece of history about Marjorie Rowland. Proceeds benefit the ACLU of Delaware. Thank you. And I think Karen and Maggie might even sign some books. If they weren't before, they are now. So thank you everybody for coming tonight, and we so appreciate you. Have a great one. Thanks everyone.